The local church is the hope of the world, not because the church in itself is anything special, but because it is the vehicle that God has chosen throughout the ages to spread His message and to display His love to the world. And when the church, God's people, captured by the love of God and His message of hope, live out and choose to follow His call every day, the evidence of God's goodness, love, and wisdom is made even more evident. This is the story of Common Ground, just one local church in the beautiful city of Cape Town. We're looking back as we celebrate our 25-year milestone birthday in 2022. We see how we are just a part of a bigger story, a story God has been writing through all of time. And we see how, as we respond to the call of God every day with a simple yes, the vision of God over decades is brought to life. When Rigby and Sue Wallace said yes to planting Common Ground back in 1997, they were saying yes to loving God and His people, joining with about 50 people who were part of that original planting community. How could they know how much more God was going to use that simple yes to extend His mission in Cape Town? God's call has always sounded simple. Love God and love others. God's goodness is too great to keep to ourselves. It feels scandalous that we, ordinary people, would get to experience God's love and fullness of life without any merit of our own. And through loving others, God's love abounds within us.
Over the first decade of Common Ground, God was planting seeds of love and generosity deep within us by His grace and wisdom, preparing us for things we couldn't even begin to imagine. One of the prophetic words spoken over us was a decade of preparation for decades of harvest. In 2001, we said yes to discipling young lives through our Year of Your Life team, and so the Fuel team was birthed. Hundreds of young lives were impacted as this team did ministry into various Cape Town schools. And many of these Fuel teamers went on to lead ministries, to step into leadership in the marketplace, and some even to plant churches. In 2005, a small group of justice-minded people put their hands up to start the Friends First Foundation that in 2008 became what is now known as Common Good. This organization has mobilized many more Christ followers to understand God's heart for justice and the poor, and to work out our faith in practical ways to serve the most vulnerable in our city. Hearts towards heaven and hands towards humanity has become one of the axioms we live by.
2008 had seen terrible xenophobic attacks erupt across South Africa, and this seemed to catalyze God's community across the country into mobilizing to respond. Where we may have thought it was just a momentary opportunity to show God's love to people in our spheres, God clearly had grander and more loving ideas. He took some of our community members and ignited a passion and heart to work deeper into these pockets of community. Andre and Tambwe launched a small group out of the community that developed over this time of xenophobia, and out of this, launched our network branch of Common Good, helping individuals prepare for and find employment. God prompted us not to wait for people to come to us, but rather to say yes to going to them. We didn't even fully understand what this meant. But in 2009, when a group of Common Grounders said yes to the call of God to take the blessings that God had sown in Common Ground Rondebosch and plant a new community of people in the inner city area, we started getting our first glimpse.
It quickly became evident that God was calling us to take His message of love deeper and wider into our city. In 2010, we said yes to take another small group of Bosch members who put their hands up to God's call, and we planted a third community in Constantiaberg, while Bosch AM simultaneously also planted an evening community more dedicated to discipling and evangelizing the student and young adult community in the Rondebosch area. In 2011, Andre and Sabrina and Tambwe then said a further yes to God's prompting as they led the community that had gathered around them relationally into becoming what is now our Wynberg congregation, another gospel access point, stirring even more individuals towards God and others in the surrounding area as a result. Meanwhile, across other sections of our family, God was stirring our Constantiaberg community to launch a new congregation in the South Peninsula to take God's message of love, rescue, and restoration to the southern communities of Cape Town.
All the way across in the northern suburbs, God was calling individuals from Bosch and a 10-year-old community called Generations Church to say yes to His orchestration of a merger. And a new Common Ground Durbanville congregation was birthed out of two shared histories. Bosch AM and PM, in the meanwhile, were also feeling the call towards the suburb of Tableview. And in 2015, God opened doors and called Roger and Nikki Haynes to say their yes to launching this new congregation. Later, in 2020, this congregation would move into the Blouberg area and rebrand as Common Ground Blouberg, finding a more centrally located venue to reach the area to which they feel called.
All along these different stories, God was leading Common Good to help disciple our communities to better process and respond to the social giants within Cape Town and show His heart for the poor and vulnerable. Through rigorous life-giving research, in 2014, Common Good decided to strategically focus all initiatives in a triple E strategy, intentionally addressing early childhood, development, employment, and education. God, in His wisdom and vision, moved various partners together over the years to form a merger between Zanokanyo and Network to form the Zanokanyo Network, TZN. Together, they were even more effective at educating and finding employment through various job readiness access points and mobile training units across 7 communities.
Through Common Good, many of our congregations launched literacy and numeracy programs in schools where extra assistance was needed. Warm-up winter campaigns ran to get clothing to those in need, and we undertook Live Under the Line campaigns to create awareness amongst people about the harsh realities and pressures facing our neighbours. People were spurred to respond as they said yes to God's call to bring compassion and justice more and more to their spheres in the city. We could never have guessed that through all these moments of saying yes to God, He still had more in store. In 2016, Common Good entered into an agreement with key partners in the Western Cape Education Department to pilot a new model of education. Through academic and operational interventions, the impact of educators has been strengthened and empowered, and this enabled learners to grow in their academic confidence and performance. In 2017, Kevin and Claire Murphy felt the call to extend the inner city congregation to a new site to create another meeting in Sea Point. They had no idea of the community waiting to meet God through this act of obedience and generosity.
With Zanokanyo having done a lot of work into Langa already, we saw God moving and calling a community together there. In 2019, Ziba and Shadi and Bense said their yes to leading and launching Common Ground Langa, a church seeking to fill that community with the message, life, and fame of Jesus in fresh and authentic ways. That same year, Common Good said a further yes, and after years of research into the importance of the first 1,000 days of a child's life, they launched Sikunye, which means we are together in isiXhosa. Sikunye works to strengthen local church communities across the nation to see that they provide support and encouragement to families, ensuring that their young children get what they need to get a strong start to life. We couldn't have dreamed how far the reach of this amazing initiative would get. Being forced to go online by the 2020 COVID pandemic, we went from being a city-serving initiative to suddenly a nation-serving ministry, with over 300 churches across South Africa joining the Sikunye network by the end of 2021. They have committed themselves to caring for families in the first 1,000 days. What else does God have in store for these communities and families as He works through His people, His bride, His church in South Africa?
At the beginning of 2020, Steve and Candice Bonaconza said their yes to taking a group of Common Grounders up the M5 corridor, launching Common Ground M5, a small community based at a local school venue, serving and reaching the surrounding suburbs. What would have seemed ill timing, considering the global pandemic striking not even 2 months later, was further evidence of God's wisdom, as both our youngest congregations, Langa and the M5, with the assistance of the citywide family of churches, were able to serve some of the most vulnerable and enable people to meet online and have the devices and data required to experience community during the months of lockdown. We have seen how God has brought our people closer to Himself and to community, even over the many tough months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have seen how He has called us as His people to bless those around us, providing the means and tools needed. In this time, we have seen thousands of Common Grounders saying yes to serving, extending, and giving of their time, talents, and money to ensure that we could love and support those who were hit hardest by the pandemic. God never stopped moving and calling His church to serve the city. And we were astounded by how He continued to advance His kingdom in compassion and mercy through our partnership with Common Good and through local congregational initiatives and programs.
Even in the midst of hardship, we experienced God's goodness and provision during 2020. We also experienced a fresh desire to gather after months of lockdown. And of course, in God's faithfulness, we saw the provision of amazing venues. Common Ground South Penn moved into a new space in November 2020, which they are looking to develop even further in a joint venture with other Kingdom allies. Constantiaberg also moved venues while simultaneously launching their building project as they hope to build a base to establish their serving presence in the suburbs even further. In the same year, through an existing relationship, the beautiful Bridges Retreat Centre in Franschhoek came under our care and stewardship. Put into a separate trust, it's poised to be used as a place for young people to be shaped and transformed by the gospel amidst the beauty of God's creation. We look forward to seeing God's story unfold in all of these spaces. Our Durbanville congregation, who've been praying for months for the provision of a new congregation leadership couple, welcomed Brendan and Tash Locke into this role in August 2021. In 2020, we also saw God's wisdom in reconsolidating our Greenpoint and Sea Point congregations back into one community, based in a beautiful old church building in Sea Point. This meant we could plant a base on the Atlantic seaboard that would serve not only Sea Point, but also the surrounding suburbs with intentional focus. Likewise, in Bosch, the call to become one congregation once again was felt. Bosch AM and PM linked arms and became one Bosch, allowing for a greater and richer intergenerational partnership with a greater reach into Rondebosch and the surrounding suburbs.
One of the things we reflect on in our journey is the amazing people God has brought into our story through the years. Members, congregants, volunteers, staff, leaders, pastors. We've enjoyed a rich intersection of lives and an inflow and outflow of people. Numbers of people through the years have left to strengthen and even lead other churches. The Carols and the Hulls into the rural area of Nguvumba, Vainant and Marion to Australia, Kevin and Claire Murphy to lead a church in Hong Kong, Blake and Rachel Tucker to plant a new church into the nation of Madagascar, and Steve and Candace Bonaconza to plant a new church out from Common Ground in 2022.
As we celebrate this high moment of 25 years together, we rejoice in the magnificence of God's grace, guidance, and wisdom, and His amazing work in and through us over more than 2 decades. As individuals coming together in community under the banner and grace of a loving Savior and obeying the everyday call of Jesus on our lives and saying our everyday yeses, we see a tapestry of God's remarkable work. It is evidence of His greatness, power, and kindness that He would take our meager offerings along the way and magnify them by His power and love into the story we now get to look back on. And in this next chapter, as we embark on moving from being one church with many congregations to being a family of churches, again, we sense the call for us to go wider and deeper into our city, with each church uniquely positioned to serve and reach the geographical places where they have been planted. So today, we continue to choose to say our own everyday yes to God's plan. Yes to remaining in His will and ways. Yes to partnering with Him. Yes to church by church and person by person, continuing to fill our beautiful city of Cape Town with the message, life, and fame of Jesus.